Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Espen Kraft, and I'm going to take you through this issue of Keyboard Magazine with a fat, nice Depeche Mode picture there. This is issue October 1986. That's some time ago, and we have a lot of fun stuff to cover in this issue, so it's going to be a long one. And no surprises here, the two first pages belongs to Korg with their ads, and you have the Korg DDD1 drum machine to the right there. And I love how they often get real drummers to endorse drum machines, not only Korg but other manufacturers as well. We have Keith Emerson with his SG1 grand piano on the left there. He was a big endorser of that model, I remember. And another thing, you couldn't see that from the beginning, but this issue is the first one with a perfect binding. It has a square spine, and that actually makes it a little bit harder to turn the pages and have the magazine lay still and flat on the surface, which I'm using for my videos, but I'll manage. And also pay attention to that Programming the JX Clinic. We'll get back to that later. A very nice article. We also have some soundtrack pages, the soundtrack to Big Trouble in Little China, and some Casio reviews as well. So there's a lot to cover, like I said, in this issue. The section of letters to the editor, I paid attention to that one column to the right there where one guy is starting an Oberheim expander group, a forum, but I assume this being 1986 that it's by letter only, mail, paper mail. 2 pages of fast forward with Passport. I remember that Passport MPU 401 for the IBM PC compatible computers. That was pretty big over here. A guest editorial about the ethics of sampling. That was a big discussion back then, and check out that Super JX ad. I've told you this before, but I toured with a band for a couple of years, and I used a Super JX in my rig back then. Very nice keyboard, very nice fat analog sounds, and I wouldn't have space for that now. Ah yes, the questions page. This is where you could write in questions, technical or musical questions, and you'd get answers, hopefully. Here's a guy asking, is it possible to send sound data from an Akai AX80 to a computer for storage on disk? And no, that's not possible on the AX80. One guy says that a local dealer told me that the Yama KX88 will only output the velocity information up to a maximum of level 97. Is that true? The answer, no, it will send up to 127, but you'd have to press pretty hard to reach those numbers. And one guy is dissatisfied with the Prophet 2000 factory samples. That's just only a handful of samples, really. Rare for a sampler to have samples stored in ROM at boot up, actually. And a nice fat display of the Kurzweil K250. Now that was an expensive one, I can tell you. And here we have the big soundtrack in Little China. And they've spoken to Alan Howarth, and he's the one making the music in relationship with John Carpenter, the director. As you know, Carpenter often wrote his own scores for his movies. But let's see what they used in terms of tech. Okay, so they have the Kurzweil K250 that we just saw in the ad. Sampling from an emulator 2, and they used a Macintosh Plus computer. They used Prophet 2002, that's the rack mount version of the Prophet 2000. Prophet 5, Prophet 10, Emulator 1, Oberheim 4-voice, SP12, Lin, LM1 and the Lin drum, and 2 Avatar guitar-controlled synthesizers. It looks like they used a Kurzweil harp and a koto from the emulator to get that nice oriental feel going, because it is set in an oriental environment. So that's nice. He's not a real big fan of the Dx7, he says. But he did use the Prophet VS. So that's cool. Lots of layering with MIDI. And we have a Shure ad to the right there. And this is interesting. This is James Serafine to the left there. He's a sound designer, and he's talking about his sound design for Poltergeist 2, the movie. And he's openly saying he worked closely with Jerry Goldsmith, the composer. And he's using a lot of samplers, emulators, and he's addressing the voices in the movie, the ghost voices. There's a lot of ghost voices in this movie. I remember this movie pretty good, actually. I like it, and there's a lot of eventide harmonization going on. He uses his own voice a lot and let it swim in delay and harmonization to get those voices for the ghosts. What was the name of that guy, that creepy guy in Poltergeist 2? Kane, was it? Kane? Can't remember right now, but I think it was Kane. A very scary figure, actually. Okay, moving on. Past those inlays here. Need a gift for a musician. Tascam reel-to-reel ads and 3 rock piano giants. You have some cool ones here. Fats Domino, Paul Schaefer, Ray Charles, and Jerry Lee Lewis. And here's an ad to make you take a course for achieving perfect pitch, which can be learned, they say. Ah yes, the ESQ1 from Ensoniq, a very nice synthesizer. TX Rack, create a TX216 for $500 or less. Personal composer there to the left. And MIDI Verb and MIDI FX from Alesis. Anyone remember those? I'm sure you do. Symphony's 128 voice RAM for the Roland keyboard and drum machines. It's the JX8P right there, but did it work for other Rolands as well? Remembering Teddy Wilson. What else? The conclusion to that Big Trouble in Little China article. And Howard says that it's all layers now. He's layering 4 or 5 MIDI instances to get that sound he wants. Check out that MIDI blender, that MIDI merger to the left here. I never saw that. It's at JL Cooper, yes. Okay, so we have in reviews, not many pop acts in this review section this time. We have the Jan Hammer, the early years. And look at that. Hybrid Arts to the left, but a nice Atari ad to the right there. The Atari ST was riding high at this point. What's those keyboards? The Mirage Dx7, and is that a Kawai K3 at the top there? It sure looks like it. And we have the Seal DK70 portable 8-voice synthesizer going for $5.95. And some reviews of patches for the Korg DW8000. Movie review of Herbie Hancock's work in Round Midnight. Creative options, do you have imagination? It's the article. And an ad for the Elka one-man band options. And here's one of the major features of this issue, Sessions in Nashville. It's basically a look at the different recording studios and things you can do in Nashville in terms of studio work and session work. And this guy sure has a lot of cool gear. What can we pick out? A Fairlight, a PPG 2.2, Oberheim drum machine sequencers, an OB8 it seems, and DX7. It looks like the rates are about $200 per 4-hour block. Adjusted for inflation and things like that, I have no idea if that's good or bad for being 1986. So if anyone wants to chip in, please do in the comment section. It seems that synthesizers are a big thing in Nashville at that time in terms of jingles for radios and televisions and stuff like that. So there was not only country music in Nashville back then. 16TT Technos, Imaginative Resynthesis, Has any of you actually used this or seen this before? I can't say I've seen this at all. Is this the first ad I've seen of it as well? Please say so in the comment section. A DX7 there to the right. And these ads for the DBK keyboard synthesizers, that's really the Crumar bit synthesizers. I think they were rebranded for the American market, but these are all Italian. Look at that Sultan Programmer 24S. That's going for a lot of money right now, actually. And a big fat Akai S612 sampler with the MD280 disk drive. Very nice. The S612 was one of the more affordable sampling systems back then. And Mellotron ES2000 XT. Never used that either. If any of you has used that Mellotron system, please say so in the comment section. The microphone from TOA. Piano meets synthesizer. To the left, let a celebrity play your MIDI keyboard. An ad for basically MIDI files. And an ad from Voyatra to the right there, Voyatra Technologies and their Sequencer Plus especially. That was a nice sequencer. And here we have that keyboard clinic that really made me understand how the JX8P worked back then, and the JX10 as well, of course. Same thing, basically, just two JXPs in a box. And this is written by Eric Persing, and most of you know who that man is. Persing made most of the famous presets and basically all the presets for the most iconic Roland synthesizers of the 80s. And he's going really in depth here and showing how every parameter works in the JX synthesizers. And he's attached a lot of presets. He's going through the parameters and how they interact with each other and essential reading. Music Tech 86 in Burbank, 20th of October. Did any of you watching this actually go there? Please say so in the comment section. I'd love to hear about it. And here's another great feature of this issue, the wilder side of Depeche Mode. And this article is primarily focused on Alan Wilder, as Alan Wilder was the only one that would actually talk to Keyboard Magazine at this time about the gear used, the tech used, and how they set up their live rig for this tour at this time. And they start off the interview by letting him talk about that his interests has always been more with the musical rather than with the technical side of things. So he worked on different stuff before joining the group. And he was looking through Melody Maker for jobs and saw an ad for a name synthesizer band looking for a new keyboard player. And so he auditioned with about 20 other applicants and he got the job. That's cool. He goes on saying he didn't know of the band at the time. He hadn't heard any of the songs either. That's pretty cool. It's actually interesting to read that both Gore and Fletcher declined to talk to Keyboard Magazine at this time. And the reason seems to be that Depeche Mode did not consider itself a keyboard band and didn't want to seem like they were endorsing any special type of brand or type of gear. But apparently Alan Wilder wanted to talk about different types of stuff. Good for us. At this point, they have a lot of tracks on backing tapes for their live performances. And so they prepare the tapes. That's basically something Wilder do. And an interesting question. You got 3 keyboard players on stage spread out across a broad setup. When playing live, are you able to maintain visual contact with one another? And Wilder's response, no, that's not really too important to us. We're cued by what we've prepared on the tapes. And another interesting question, do you each have your own monitor mix? What we all have is an overall rough mix in the side fills of the whole band, except I don't have Fletcher's synthesizers in my fills because they're really not necessary. So no surprises there. Another thing, they have a problem with Dave's vocal being very, very loud in the monitor systems, and they're working to get that down in level, I can imagine. And then the interview goes on about the aspects of touring, etc., the stage setup in terms of percussion. But one question which I turn that back. From watching you perform, it appears that Andrew Fletcher on the extreme right of the stage does most of the bass lines. Well, he says, Alan Wilder, not really. He does bass on 1 or 2 songs. It's difficult to explain what everyone does because we all swap and do different things at different times. Some of the bass parts are on tape. Some of them I play. A couple of them Andy plays. Okay, so what equipment are you using on this tour? Well, he says Martin uses an Emulator 2 and a PPG 2.2. Andy has a Sequential Prophet 2000, and I have an Emulator 2 and a Korg Poly 800. That's interesting. The Korg is very much a secondary keyboard, he says. For those times when you can't fit the last sound on the emulator patch because they use 1 disc per song, so they have to change discs throughout the show, and if they have too much sounds needed for a song, he is using the Korg Poly 800 to complete the setup for that song, apparently. He then gets asked if you alter your sounds much during your performances, and he says, no, not at all. It's all pre-prepared. I work on the sounds a lot before we go on tour and make sure that every individual volume is the right for each sound. Every filter, every wheel position, all the tunings, everything is set up properly before we go on tour. So there's not any room for improvisation, it seems. You have no rack-mounted effects on stage at all? No, we don't use any effects on stage. He says that all the sounds are sampled with the effects on it, so they don't have to faff around with that while doing their performances. And that's something I've noticed before as well in other interviews and videos I've seen of their live setups. Finally, they ask if, as a trained keyboardist, do you find any particular challenge to play with Depeche Mode? He says, our music is not particularly complicated, it never has been and probably never will be. There's no room for solos or anything like that, so purely from a playback point of view, the challenge for him is that he prepares everything in terms of music for that tour, so that's his main challenge, really. Do you have plans to go into some projects on your own, possibly outside the band's work? I have some sort of vague plans, yeah, nothing too rigid. Playing organ for silent times, cool article on that. That must have been a fun gig, really, playing organs or pianos for silent movies back then. No bull, this is a real keyboard amplifier. Jim Cox doing acoustic guitar parts on emulators. That should be a lot of fun, and he has some cool stuff in his rig here. Roland MSQ 700 sequencer on top there, Yama Dx7, Prophet 5, OB8, DW8000, Emulator 2, Emulator 1. And here it actually is, the Kawai K3. I wondered if we saw that in a picture before in this issue, and it's now been confirmed. Data cassettes for the DX line. And here's Nile Rodgers endorsing the Synclavier, of course, with even more expensive stuff peeping out from the left there. More Akai stuff, the S612 again with the AX60. And I've shown in an earlier video how we can connect these two to run the S612 through the AX60's filter. Mark of the Unicorn to the left there with their Performer software. Tubecraft keyboard stands. They had a lot of different stands. There's no telling what a drummer might do with the Mirage. That was a cool ad. Jazz for Lizards. And more Shure ads and the book, The Art of Electronic Music. I'm sure a lot of you guys have that. From motive to melody and DigiDesign to the right there. They existed in 1986. The SDR 1000 stereo digital reverb from Ibanez. I would actually like to have that one to test out now. Jan Hammer used to endorse it. And that's a nice little article to the left there, a DIY solution for wiring your DIN to XLR adapter. I love these DIY articles from old keyboard magazines. I used to test out some of that back then as well. A lot of times actually, because I was much more into electronics and components back then than I am now. You don't see articles like this in music tech magazines today. Things have changed radically. Lin 9000 tips and tricks, the TR505 drum machine ad from Roland. More Roland to the left there, the MIDI interface, MPU 401, very popular, like I said earlier. And that MIDI controller to the right there, the voice, I've never seen those. Any of you have any experience with those? Please say so in the comment section. Controlling volume in a multi-keyboard setup. Well, we've all struggled with that, I guess, if you had several keyboards in a multi-setup. And since we're coming towards the end, we have the keyboard reports. And this time they're focused on the Casio CZ1, AZ1, and SK1. A synth, a guitar, and that little sampling keyboard, which we've all tried at one time. I have a video on that on my channel, a very cool little thing. For many people, their first encounter with sampling, actually. That's the Roland Alpha Juno to the left there. A DX7 voice editor to the left. There were so many DX7 voice editors back then. Power amplifier. And more DX7 ads, cartridges, of course. With so many people finding the DX7 cumbersome or difficult to learn back then, there was a lot of momentum for putting out cartridges with sounds for the DX7 and the DX instruments, really. MIDI bass, never heard that one. Never seen one. Maybe I should fill out that form so they can send me that MIDI bass cassette. Young Chang. Pianos. Rock keyboard book. 30 years of red hot rock. Texture 2 sequencer for the IBM PC. There were a lot of sequencers for the IBM PC back then. Keep this book a secret. Beginning synthesizer. Doing it in the closet. Well, that's nice. Ad for Fostex Porta Studios to the right there. That was the time for that. Buy some back issues of Keyboard Magazine, of course. And that's Guy Fletcher from Dire Straits. He was just getting into Atari computers back then. I have that in another article in another issue. Studio Plus from Opcode. And of course, the cuddly little Yama FB01 sound module. I know a lot of you guys have a love relationship with this module. It's gained cult status, as with the TX81Z. And the FB01 was really many people's only way of getting into the DX sounds, the FM synthesis back then, because it was a lot cheaper than the DX7, which costs a lot for the amateur musician back then. The Akai AX73, the 440 system from Sequential. And that Kurzweil 150 module expander there, I've never seen one of these. It's supposed to come with a lot of sounds. Morley, keyboard players, and Manny's Music, of course. I've mentioned them before. Big, nice black and white ad towards the end here. Less and less color as we come towards the end. But here we have the keyboard classifieds. And let me see if I can pick out some to put things into perspective in terms of price and desirability. This is 1986. And we have a Synclavier for 48K. We have Prophet 5 going for 900, Minimoog 500, Oberam Dx600. I can see a Roland SH101 going for $110. Juno 60 going for $425. Juno 6 going for $300. And MS-10 from Korg going for $85. Moog Prodigy, $125. But the Mirage is $1,050. So sampling was in vogue and analog synthesizers were not. So no surprises there. And of course, lots of ads for sound designers and cartridges and sounds on tape, etc. for different types of synthesizers. And they also started with the keyboard crossword in this issue. So if you were knowledgeable about artists and brands and books and stuff like that, you could solve the crossword. An ad for the Oberheim Prommer towards the end, and at the end we have that Yamaha FB01 sound module again. And with that we have basically covered this issue of Keyboard Magazine, October 1986. I had a lot of fun going through this issue with you, and I hope you had a good time as well. I also want to thank my Patreon supporters that makes it possible for me to do this on a weekly basis. And especially Glenn Lindmark, Matt Phillips, Teddy McSnuggins, Creating Tracks, David Ryle, Felix Bowman, Jack Zimmerman, Jan Tucek, Stefan LaForce, Carl Bate, Rich Jones, C-Strap, Tail Trap, Masayuki Asahi, and Anders Enger Jensen. Thanks guys, you rock. I'm Espen Kraft and I am the 80s. So until we meet again, have a good one. Cheers.